Hello, and welcome to our fourth lecture in this module on attention, in our summer series, online series in Cognition. In this particular lecture, we're going to talk about selective attention and visual attention, which has some really important applications, which we're going to talk about here at the end of this lecture. I'm going to start with a quick demonstration. This is a classic demonstration of visual attention from Ulrich Neisser. And so what you'll do here is you will count the number of times the team in black, you can see there's someone in a black shirt and there's people in white t-shirts. The people in black t-shirts, count the number of times they pass the ball back and forth. You have to pay very close attention as they pass the ball back and forth, because as you can see, it's kind of difficult to see. So pay very close attention, and we'll talk about this demonstration here in just a moment. Okay, do you have a number? Okay, well, if you have a number, the next question is, did you see the girl walk through carrying an umbrella? Some of you may have, some of you may not have. So let's watch this again. There you can see her walking right through. Most people are really quite surprised by this illusion. I know the first time I saw it, I was convinced there was no girl in an umbrella. I completely missed her going by. The important part of this is it illustrates that if we're focusing on one part of our visual world, we can see something pass right in front of us and not see it at all. And we're going to talk about this in a variety of different circumstances, but it's a really important lesson when it comes to understanding technology and how immersive technology and augmented reality and heads-up displays can have some unintended consequences, because people who design those systems oftentimes don't understand that you can look right at something and not see it. So that gets us then to today's lecture on attention. We're going to start by talking about selective attention beyond that which we've already talked about. We talked about some selective attention with dichotic listening. We'll talk about some other types of selective attention. We'll then spend some time looking at visual attention. In particular, we'll spend some time talking about feature integration theory. We'll then talk about attention and visual perception, and then talk about applications of visual attention. So let's start with selective attention, which simply refers to our ability to focus our attention on a specific object, location, message, or other stimulus. The important thing about selective attention is it applies to a variety of different circumstances. So you can focus on a specific aspect of a visual scene. So in the last demonstration, you were focusing on the passing of the ball, not the girl walking through with an umbrella. In the dichotic listening, you were listening to a specific person who's at a specific location or a specific message, or even focus on one aspect of a stimulus, which we'll look at here in the Stroop Task, where you focus on the color of the ink and try to ignore the word. This requires an allocation of attentional resources. We have limited cognitive resources to allocate to a task, and our cognitive load then is the amount of resources required to carry out a task. We know, of course, that automatic tasks use fewer resources, so the better we get at a task, the more we've done it, the fewer attention resources they require, but they still require attentional resources. So this is an important component of thinking about things like selective attention. If it requires a lot of your focus and attention to select one thing out of your environment, then it's coming at a cost to other attentional tasks. So if you're talking on your telephone, that's taking up cognitive resources from your ability to drive your car, and that's something we're going to talk about in our next lecture. So some examples of selective attention tasks that we conduct or use in conducting research in this area are, of course, dichotic listening, which we talked about in the previous lecture, where participants focus on one ear and ignore the message in the other ear. Today we're going to talk about the flanker task and the Stroop task. These are both important selective attention tasks. This is the flanker task, and in a flanker task, participants are instructed to press the Z key when an A or a B are the center letter, or M when C or D. So In this instance, we have what's called a compatible trial. So we have compatible flankers. That's why it's called the flanker task. So you're going to press Z if there's an A or a B here. And so it very quickly, easily able to press the Z key because there's no competing information. Here we have incompatible flankers. So you're supposed to press the Z key with an A or an M key with a C or D, but only if it's in the center space. So you have to actively ignore or inhibit your response to that C or D. So you're actively ignoring that particular these particular flankers. This is what takes the longest. So the measure in these studies is reaction time. And so compatible trials are the fastest, incompatible trials are the slowest, and then here we have neutral flankers that have no relevance whatsoever to the task, and we're right there in the middle between compatible trials and incompatible trials. We're going to talk about the flanker task in the very last lecture in attention when we talk about the neuropsychology of attention, and we'll take a look at Posner's attentional networks. And the flanker task is an important part of the attentional network task. Our next task is the Stroop task, and those of you in my cognition class will actually get a chance to conduct some sort of short demonstrations on this. You might even recruit some others to do this. But the basic idea behind the Stroop task is this is the sort of color inconsistent condition in the Stroop task. There are usually some other conditions that go along with this, but this is the one that really illustrates the Stroop phenomenon. The task here is for you to read out the colors of the ink across this display. So you have to ignore the word and focus on the color of the, well, it's not ink in this case, but the color of the word on the screen. So it would be yellow, green, yellow, orange, green, blue, blue, yellow, blue, green, yellow, orange, orange, green, orange, blue, green, orange. And you get better at it as you go through them, and you can see that you sort of get more, you increase your ability to ignore that word. But you'll find this is more difficult than you would imagine. There are other variants of this task. There's emotional Stroop tasks where emotional words automatically capture our attention, and it's more difficult to read out the color of those words. And we also see this kind of task gets more difficult as we get older. And so older adults oftentimes have difficulty ignoring certain stimuli. That gets us then to talking about visual attention. So in visual attention, we talk about how we pay attention to certain objects within our visual field or locations within our visual field. And the first thing we'll talk about is what's called the spatial orienting task. And this is part of what's called the Posner cueing paradigm. And again, we'll talk more about this when we talk about Posner's attentional networks in the 6th lecture on attention coming up. So the Posner cueing paradigm we'll take a look at here on the next screen. What happens is people are cued to a particular location, and on usually about 80% of the trials, the cue directs them to the location where our target is going to appear, and then they are to press a key as soon as that target appears. And so measures reaction time, and they're fast at finding that location when they've been cued to that location. However, sometimes that cue leads to the incorrect location. So on 20% of the trials, the cue is invalid. And as a result, it takes a lot longer to find the target that participants are looking for because they have actually actively inhibited those other locations. At least that's what there's evidence for. So it looks something like this. Here we have a location cue directing the participant's attention down here, and the cue appears over in this area. And the evidence is that they focus their attention here and actively ignore these other locations on these invalid trials. We'll take a look at some more of these results again when we talk about Posner's network tasks in the neuropsychology of attention lecture. There is evidence that this location-based attention is part of what we call the WARE pathway, which is the dorsal stream. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about visual perception. We're going to revisit the what versus where pathways when we get to talking about the neuropsychology of attention. There is also evidence for object orienting, so a distinct system for directing our attention to particular objects. So you select an object out of your visual world and you follow that object or focus your attention on that object. And that object orienting system is believed to be part of the what pathway that we talked about previously. So our visual attention includes both spatial locations and also includes information about what things are. That leads us then to feature integration theory. And feature integration theory is used to explain how we are able to search our environment for particular visual objects. And this is something we do all the time without realizing that's what we're doing. So if you're driving down the road trying to find a Starbucks, you're searching your visual environment for that green logo that you know so well. If you're at the grocery store and you're looking for a particular product, so you're looking for Cheerios, you look for that bright yellow box that we all grew up with, and you're doing that by scanning your visual environment. There are some important applications of feature integration theory we'll talk about here in a minute, but here's some examples about how this is done. So performance on a visual search task will depend on the target, so what you're looking for, as well as the background, which are generally distractors, so whatever's surrounding it. How easy or difficult it is to find an object will depend on what's around it. And again, you saw something similar to this in that visual search task from earlier in the term. So this is a basic pop-out phenomenon. You'd be looking for the blue R. Easy to find, it pops right out at you. Here we're looking for G, amongst a red G amongst red cues. So obviously that R really pops out for color. The G is still pretty easy to spot, maybe not quite as easy. And then we get looking for the orange Q embedded here. And this becomes much more difficult and takes participants a lot more time to find that orange Q amongst these other fairly similar stimuli. So you have to search them one by one to try to find that orange Q in the second row, third position. So, according to feature integration theory, there are two kinds of searches for this kind of visual task. A feature search, which occurs only when a single feature is required to detect the target. And that's why we can accomplish those sort of pop-out searches so quickly. So we'll take a look at what these feature searches look like. So it's basically this. This is a feature search. So this occurs only when a single feature is required to detect the target. So we call that a pop-out. So it pops right out at you. You can search the entire visual field at once, pops right out at you. A conjunction search is required when two features must be used in conjunction with one another to detect the target. So in this case, we are trying to find an orange G. Pardon me. So you'll actually have to do some more difficult searching for that orange G compared to that feature search, which it pops right out at you. So these searches take longer. And feature integration theory is here to explain why that is. So this explains the ease of a feature search compared to a conjunction search. Now, you've all experienced a feature search versus a conjunction search, or at least most of you have. Many of you, I'm sure, have tied a brightly colored ribbon to your luggage, or have bought a different color of luggage, so that when you're standing there at the luggage carousel looking for your luggage, you can find it right away. You have intentionally made it so that you can find your luggage based on a feature search. Those of us who never think to do that until they're standing at the luggage carousel trying to find our navy blue or black bag have to do a conjunction search. So we know what color our bag is, then we have to look at it and see if it's the right shape, if it's my luggage, is it the right amount of distressed because it's falling apart. All of these are individual features that you have to combine together, and so it takes longer. So in feature integration theory, each feature is associated with a mental map across the visual field. So you can you have a different map for each feature, color, shape, etc. So for every stimulus, the features are represented immediately, simultaneously, and pre-attentively. So you can basically see the entire visual field in front of you. So we call this being done in parallel. So during a feature search, we monitor the relevant map for the presence of a feature. So we can basically search the entire visual field at once. So that makes it so that feature searches are independent of the size of the display. So when you're at the airport, it doesn't matter how many people's bags are there. If you're the only one with a pink camo bag, you're going to find it right away because it's going to pop right out at you. And people do this also with groups of people out at amusement parks or out at museums. They want to be able to find each other easily, so they'll all wear the same color shirt so that they can find each other fairly quickly by looking for that color shirt. A conjunction search, in a conjunction search, for each object, the features must be bound together. So we have to look at color, and we have to look at shape, and then we have to use our attentional resources to combine those together, and that's to accomplish feature binding. So as we're looking for our luggage, it's navy blue and of a particular shape, we have to look for navy blue things, and then we have to look at, are they the right shape, and so that requires our attentional resources to accomplish that feature binding. So conjunction searches are carried out sequentially, one object at a time. So they take a lot longer and require much greater attentional resources. Now, this is important because product manufacturers are constantly trying to figure out ways to make their products stand out on the shelf. So they want you to be able to find them quickly, which is why people who make knockoff products try to make them look as much like the other product as possible, because they realize you're busy, you don't have time to separate out the Cheerios from the Wheatios or whatever they might be. And so they make their bags and their packages look as much alike as possible because they want you to buy their product instead of the other product. Pardon me. And so this becomes sort of an important aspect of marketing, is trying to figure out how to get your object to stand out a bit. So that is feature integration theory. We're going to now turn to talk about attention and visual perception. So we're going to do a quick card trick. I'm going to do some magic here. So first thing you'll do is you'll pick a card. Any card, as they say. Now, magically, I'm going to remove your card from this deck. Do you see your card anywhere? Of course you don't. I'm going to give you a second to think about why that is. Well, your second's up. The trick is that none of these cards match the original cards. So if you look, there's a King of Hearts, no King of Hearts. Jack of Clubs, no Jack of Clubs. King of Spades, no King of Spades. So all of the cards are different. This is what we call inattentional blindness, or even change blindness. So inattentional blindness occurs when we pay attention to one aspect of a visual scene. It makes us blind to the other aspects of the scene. So in the card trick, you pay attention to your card and don't pay any attention to the others. And then when you look at the second display, you're only looking for your card. You're not looking for the other cards, so you're not paying attention to that. That girl with the umbrella at the very beginning of the lecture is also a form of inattentional blindness. And there's also a terrific example called the monkey business illusion. So those of you in my online course, I have provided a link for you to take a look at that. For those of you who are not, you can just search on YouTube for the monkey business illusion. And Dan Simon does a really terrific job in his example, so look for that. Another part of this is what we call change blindness, and there's also a great Nova show on change blindness you can find on YouTube as well, which, again, my course students have access to, or direct access to, but you can find it. It's pretty easy. But I want to show you what change blindness looks like. So here's the classic study about change blindness. She's asking for, or he's asking for directions, sorry. She's giving directions. Oh, new guy. She doesn't even notice. Completely changes him as well as his outfit. So we'll take a look at another one. This one's a little more subtle. It's a really clever study the way they have this done. It's pretty well choreographed. Obviously they've practiced this quite a bit. And you can see a great deal of subjects don't notice that. And as I recall, it's about half or a little more than half of subjects don't notice a complete change. And again, you can find a great deal of these examples on YouTube, and they're lots of fun to look at and see. In sort of real-world examples of change blindness, this happens to us all the time. Somebody gets a haircut and you don't notice. They go to the tanning bed and you don't notice. Or even sometimes they'll put up a sign that you haven't seen. One of the so to give you an example, here at Georgetown, at Christmas they put up this great big lovely pair of Christmas trees out in front of campus. And I was standing there looking at them, and I thought, God, these trees are really lovely. I didn't notice them before. Well, it turns out they were fake. But I thought they had been there all along. So it's that sort of kind of change blindness, and that happens all the time. People are like, has it been there the whole time, or has it not been there the whole time? So sometimes it's just stuff you haven't paid attention to. But that's what we call change blindness. We'll finish our discussion of attention and visual perception by talking about inhibitory accounts of visual attention. As I talked in the Posner cueing task about spatial orienting, we believe that as we direct our attention towards locations or objects, things that we're ignoring are actually actively inhibited. It's not that we're not paying attention to them, we're actually turning down the volume on them, so to speak. The really best description of this we see is with spatial orienting, the Stroop effect as well. We have to inhibit that word. And then this really terrific study by Steve Tipper on negative priming. And so here's how negative priming works. Your task here is to name the red object. So you have to pay attention to the red object and ignore the green object. And then you get the probe. So this is what we call the attended repeat trial. Real fast on these trials. Then we have an unrelated trial. So we name the scissors and then we name the cup. Doesn't take any great amount of time, a little bit slower because you're fast because you've obviously just recognized it. The critical one here is the negative priming. So what you see is this unattended repeat. So we have the scissors here in red and the bed in green. So we name the scissors. Well, now we have to name the bed. And what we find in these studies, or what Tipper found in these studies, is that because you have been actively ignoring this bed, it takes longer to recognize the bed in the unattended repeat trial. That's why it's called negative priming. This would be repetition priming. You're faster, priming's generally faster, at identifying this object because it's been repeated. Here it's negative priming because you're slower at identifying this object because you have recently been inhibiting it. And so that's how we see that attention is an active inhibitory process, and that's a really important part of understanding attention and things like attention deficit disorder, which we'll talk about later. So we'll finish out our discussion of visual attention by looking at some really important applied aspects. And one of these is airport screening. And airport screening is a visual search task, and we'll talk about it as that, and then we'll talk about how it's also a vigilance task. So we've been through airports. You put your bag on the belt, it goes through the x-ray machine. Sometimes they make you stop and take things out, or you'll get set aside for additional screening. We'll talk about some of the reasons I think why that happens. This is a complex visual search task that involves multiple potential targets. Remember, they're looking for guns, knives, liquids, potential improvised explosive devices or bombs. So all of these things are things they have to look for. So it's not that they're looking for just one target. They're looking for multiple different kinds of targets. And it's also a pretty complicated visual scene. What the research shows us is that searching for two different types of items results in a dual target search cost. And in fact, they're looking for probably many more than two targets. In airport screening, metals are displayed as blue, so making guns and knives and guns essentially one category of item. So you can kind of see a little bit of a screen here, and then we can actually see some closer x-ray images, and you can see in the top display there's a knife, and I think it looks like a hand grenade trying to come through, and probably also that wire might be part of a bomb. I don't know. This is not my job, but excuse me. But you can see anything metal is displayed in blue, and this is part of the new technology that really helps assist airport screeners in finding things more quickly, because this creates a single feature search. And then down here you can see it looks like somebody's laptop and an umbrella is what's here. It took me a while to figure out what that was, but I'm pretty sure that's an umbrella. But you can see this is a pretty complicated task. And so what you see is that in searching for more than one type of item, observers spend more time searching and are more likely to miss a target. And in fact, what Godwin found is they tend to sort of, and others have found, they tend to perseverate on unrelated items, and so they spend a lot more time looking for them. So these are two things you don't want in airport screeners. Certainly we don't want people missing knives and guns, but we also don't want them taking a super long time to try to find a target. We actually would like them to do it quickly, because what ends up happening is you get long lines at screening checkpoints, and obviously that's not good, and then people go faster, so then they're more likely to miss targets. This is a really difficult balance to reach. Some people have suggested that you should have one screener for each object item, and that could actually be done remotely. You could have sort of almost like a call center where one person's looking for guns, one person's looking for bombs, one person's looking for knives, that sort of thing, because that information could be displayed anywhere. But one other important part of this has to do with airport screening as a vigilance task. Now remember, they're sitting there for, it used to be long periods of time. Before 9/11, people would sit at that screening checkpoint for hours on end. And now they're limited to 1 hour, and part of that has to do with the vigilance problem. So a key problem in airport screening is the relatively low prevalence of targets. There just simply aren't that many people coming through with particularly things like improvised explosive devices. And what we find is that over time, screeners' criterion drift to more conservative, resulting in more misses. So remember, we talked in the last lecture about signal detection theory. And people set a criterion, and anything above that is something they'll say, yes, that's a target. Anything below, they'll say, no, that's not a target. Well, because targets are so relatively rare, people expect targets less and less. And so you see their criterion drifts to more and more conservative. And that's a problem, because then you get more misses the longer somebody's at a screening point. This is one of the reasons why we limit their time. The other thing we see in the research is a period of increased prevalence has been shown to return screeners to a more liberal criterion. So the solutions to these problems are we limit screeners' time at the X-ray machine and increase target prevalence by image insertion. So what happens at the checkpoint is they will often, the computer which is processing your X-ray image of your bag will insert some of these rare objects. And that's how you get pulled aside for screening, for additional screening, is the computer has randomly projected something into your bag. And so they'll manually search it, swab it down to make sure it's not explosives, that sort of thing. So it's nothing personal at that point if it's done this way. Airport screening is a whole complex issue, and of course a lot of the parts of this are not well known, but they really do a careful job of screening both luggage and people. But that's one of the things they do to try to affect the visual attention of airport screeners, is by using that kind of technology. So it's a pretty interesting application of the kinds of things we've been talking about. The other thing I want to talk about are some new car technologies and heads-up displays. And this is an area that the research is a bit mixed about. It depends on the kind of heads-up display. But if you think back to the monkey business illusion and the girl with the umbrella walking through, you can be paying attention to a visual scene and not see something right in front of you. And so if you, based on that science, if you're focusing your attention here on this display, most people think they can see what's behind it, but we've seen from the research that that's not the case. So somebody could walk right here, and because you're focused on some aspect of this, you're actually not going to see somebody walk right in front of you. So what's important about these displays is to think about different ways to limit the amount of information. So this is an augmented reality heads-up display, and this, I think, has some real potential benefits. So this is augmented reality navigation. So rather than having to look down at your navigation screen to see where to turn or try to listen to hear where you're supposed to turn, it's right there in front of you. It shows you what lane you're supposed to be in. So this, I think, could have some benefits. The other types of augmented reality include things like this. Warning lights to say, look, you're about to hit a car in front of you, or there's a pedestrian crossing in front of you. I've even seen some with radar that if it's a very foggy, rainy night, it will show you where the road is. So these, I think, have some potential. The biggest problem from what I've seen in the research is what are called emissive projection displays. And these are where, so in the augmented reality, it's displayed out in front of you, out over the hood, out on the road. In these, it's displayed in the glass itself. And this is a particularly terrible version because I don't even know how you see the car in front of you. And that's a really important part of thinking about these heads-up displays. So the data that I've seen are these emissive projection displays are really terrible. So as I said, the data shows that those are worse for attention, that they are more of a distraction. I think limiting information may be one of the key concerns, so not having very much information and very small part of the visual display. The idea behind the heads-up display is it's safer because you're not looking down at your speedometer, but it turns out people look down at their speedometer, they know they're not looking at the road, so they do it quickly. Whereas with heads-up displays, there's some evidence that people will look at it and then not realize they're not seeing the road. In planes, in particular, the 787 Dreamliner, pilots can punch a button and it will declutter the heads-up display. So if there's a concern about what's happening, they can declutter the display and as a result have a clearer just overall view. And so I think that may be something that's key. The other thing in airline studies is that training is really important. And that is concerning for me from an automobile perspective because we don't get training. We don't have driving simulators at the dealership before we drive off in our new car. We certainly don't have one at Enterprise when we go and rent a car. And we all have, anybody who's rented a car, there's an attentional cost to the first hour that you're trying to drive a car you've never driven before. It takes you a while to figure out where things are. So I think it's something to think about. It's certainly something to be mindful of. So I don't have a great conclusion about heads-up displays other than to say I think we should be cautious in their use. All right, well that gets us to the end then of our lecture on selective and visual attention. And we will be back on our next one in talking about divided attention.